This is Franklin Rye, and welcome back to Political Spirits. We still stand for the proposition that the left and the right should have a few drinks and talk. Compromise is not a requirement. If those discussions result in us changing or even abandoning our positions, that's fine. If they don't, that's fine too. We just need to talk to each other. In that way, we can unify through speech. And if the discussion becomes a bit heated, at the end of the night, we should still be able to split up the bar tab and be on our way. So what are we going to talk about this week? Well, I'm going to talk about something deeply disturbing that's happening in China. And if you're thinking, what do I care? It's not happening here. Just bear with me, because I'm going to show you how it is actually beginning to happen here, and the threat is real. So what is it that's happening in China that's deeply disturbing? Well, they've started tracking citizen behavior and ranking the citizens using a social credit system. As noted in Business Insider, in an article dated October 29, 2018 by Alexandria entitled, "China has started ranking citizens with a creepy social credit system. Here's what you can do wrong and the embarrassing, demeaning ways they can punish you." As noted in the article, the system is expected to be fully operational nationwide in China by 2020, and it will be mandatory. Some examples of infractions include poor driving, cigarette smoking violations, buying too many video games, and posting what the government considers fake news online. So what can happen if you get a low social credit score? Well, 9 million people have already been banned from buying airline tickets for domestic flights. 3 million people have been prohibited from buying business class train tickets. The article notes that the system will also potentially be used to reduce internet speeds for those with low scores. It's also been used to restrict access to the best schools, and even more frighteningly, in July of this year, a Chinese university pulled an incoming student spot because the student's father had a bad social credit score. Such penalties obviously don't involve the extreme levels of punishment administered by North Korea, but the practice of levying penalties on other generations within a purported violator's family line is eerily similar to the practice of the North Korean regime of imposing punishments on 2 generations in either direction for the violations of one individual. Want to hear some other creepy aspects of the Chinese system? NPR provided some additional details in its October 31, 2018 Morning Edition featuring Stacey Vanek Smith and Cardiff Garcia. For example, if you buy diapers, your score will go up. But if you buy video games, you must be lazy, so your score will go down. Everyone starts with a score of 1,000. That's considered an A. 850 to 955 is a B. 600 to 849 is a C, which the government considers to be a warning level. Below that is a D, which labels you an untrustworthy citizen. An additional example of behavior which earns deductions is spreading rumors online, which gets you a deduction of 50 points. The article also points out that high scores garner specific benefits such as discounts at local businesses and even a reduction in your heating bill. When I read about programs like the one in China, I thank God that I live here in America. I remember a few years ago I actually discussed with someone whether I should pursue a position in China as a way to climb the corporate ladder at the multinational company I was with at the time. I remember thinking and saying, that's really not a good idea. The reason was because I was so confident that I couldn't keep myself from talking politics that I thought I would end up in a Chinese jail. When I think back to my assignment in Australia, where I repeatedly talked comparative politics between the U.S. and Australia and spent time ripping apart the positions of both President Obama and the Prime Minister of Australia, Kevin Rudd, who was as far to the left as Obama, I am all the more confident I would have ended up in trouble in China. So we certainly are better off than the people in China. But do we have anything like that here? Well, think for a minute about what's been happening with businesses cutting off customers from their services because of the objection of private businesses to the views expressed by the customers or the products or services sold by the customers. Look, for example, at conservative commentators who've been suspended or expelled from the digital town square in the form of YouTube or Twitter, for example, because of objections to the content or the tone of their speech. Look at the companies who've altered the products they offer customers or the customers to which they sell the products, and the pressure spurring the changes almost always coming from the left. Look, for example, to Kellogg's decision to stop advertising on Breitbart News. In November 2016, Kellogg's pulled its ads from Breitbart, and Kellogg said it did so because the site was not aligned with the values of the company. Kellogg's statement in that regard parroted the complaints from the left about the news site. I have never agreed with the left's or Kellogg's characterization of the nature of Breitbart. As I've said repeatedly on this podcast, you need to get your news and political opinion from multiple sources with different views and take it all with a grain of salt. The left was trying to eliminate Breitbart from the options that I and others could go to for news and opinion, and it did have a significant negative impact on the site. Contrary to Kellogg's virtue-signaling position that it was somehow doing a good thing by pulling its ads from Breitbart, actually what it did was assist attempts to shut down speech in America. Unfortunately, Kellogg's is not the only company which has gone along with such attempts. For my part, in protest of its actions, I haven't taken a bite of Kellogg's cereal since that date and do not expect to do so unless and until the company apologizes for its actions and reinstates advertising on Breitbart. Look to Hannity and Tucker Carlson tonight on Fox News. Both shows have been the subject of aggressive pressure on advertisers to pull their ads from the shows because of objections from the left to opinions expressed on the shows. Once again, the left was trying to shut down or alter speech on the broadcasts. Arguably scariest of all have been the attempts by the left to convince credit card companies to shut down transactions with businesses or individuals based on the content of their speech or the products they sell. Look, for example, to the fact that MasterCard and Visa, for a time, shut down the processing of donations on contributors' cards to David Horowitz's Freedom Center. The shutdown was apparently the result of, or a reaction to, objections by the Southern Poverty Law Center and Color of Change to the Freedom Center's political positions. After 4 days, the card companies rescinded the shutdown and began processing donations to the Freedom Center on their cards again. See LifeSite News coverage dated August 27, 2018, in an article by Calvin Freeberger for the results. And by the way, Color of Change is at it again, targeting credit card companies once more to treat purchasers differently to accomplish political goals that the left hasn't been able to achieve in legislatures. Look to the September 21, 2017 edition of Business Ethics in an article by Gail O'Brien entitled, quote, "A Force for Change? CEOs Speak Out on Social Issues," close quote. The author points to numerous instances of CEOs speaking out on political matters such as, quote, "discrimination in the Trump administration's travel ban," close quote, as well as CEO support for efforts to stop repeal of DACA. The article includes a quote from Apple CEO Tim Cook. Quote, "I think it's the biggest issue of our time," close quote. Quote, "This is, are we human?" Close quote. The tone of that last quote helps explain my next point. Political, as well as legal, positions on the DACA program are not uniform. No matter what Apple CEO Tim Cook may think, it's not something so obvious as opposition to child labor or slavery, for example. There are different points of view on immigration and the way in which illegal immigrants who enter the United States as children should be treated. But from the tone and the content of the Apple CEO's statement, you wouldn't think so. Is he saying that someone who has a different view of DACA, for example, that it was illegally adopted or illegally extended, or that it's bad policy because it encourages illegal immigration, is not human? Tim Cook is the CEO of a publicly traded company. That's a pretty strong statement from somebody heading a company that sells its products around the world, including some significant portion who presumably view DACA differently than Tim Cook and actually consider themselves to be human. The fact that the CEO of a publicly traded company was willing to make such a statement is evidence of what appears to be the case, specifically that companies tend to take social political positions on the left side of the political spectrum when they make these public pronouncements, or choose to restrict their advertising dollars by cutting out sites on the right, or suspending speakers on the right, or altering the sale of products which disproportionately are purchased by those on the right. So why do I mention that? Because the common conservative position is that companies are free to do business with the customers they choose and in the manner in which they choose. The market should control. If a company, such as YouTube for example, suspends a conservative commentator, then the conservative commentator is free to go elsewhere to offer his product. In this case, conservative political commentary. But what if there isn't a viable alternative site? In the case of YouTube, there isn't a comparable alternative site. So as a practical matter, if you're pushed out of the YouTube market, you're pushed out of the market. In that circumstance, does the typical conservative position really work? In theory, a competitor to YouTube more open to conservative content should have risen up and offered a comparable alternative. But that hasn't really happened, and I suspect it won't. What about the boycotts of shows like Tucker Carlson Tonight and Hannity that are pushed from the left? There's really nothing comparable from the right. Moreover, companies seem to be more sensitive to criticism coming from the left. Perhaps it goes back to the forced resignation of Brendan Eich that I talked about in Episode 3, Self-Censoring Public, after it was discovered that Mr. Eich had contributed, years before, to the California ballot initiative to have marriages designated as solely between a man and a woman. I stated in that episode that was a watershed moment in America, after which the public, including companies, have lived in fear of outrage from the left. But there's more to it than that. As universities have become more and more left-wing, and the media has become increasingly partisan Democrat rather than simply left-leaning, and the Democrat Party has moved further to the left, especially with the advancement of identity politics and expansion of the gay rights movement to encompass transgender issues, and Hollywood has moved further to the left. It seems that the instances of corporate leadership actually falling on the right side of the spectrum on social issues are nearly non-existent. That raises an interesting question. When corporations are adopting social political positions, including ones which are not directly related to their products or services, and corporations are making these decisions disproportionately on the left, whether because of actual beliefs of leadership or because of leadership's desire to avoid becoming the next Brendan Eich forced out of their position because of extreme outrage from the left-wing mob, how tenable is the conservative stance that, well, this isn't the government, these are companies, they can do what they want? If all of the companies are taking the same position on these social, political, and speech-related issues because their leaders are all Democrats, or because they fear the left-wing mob reaction if they act otherwise, or if there are no alternatives in the case of tech digital town hall platforms such as YouTube, aren't we in essence living in an ever-expanding version of the Chinese social credit system? In essence, we are. But in our case, it isn't being administered by an authoritarian government. Instead, it's being administered by a collection of tech giants who all think alike when it comes to social speech issues, and a collection of companies providing all sorts of goods and services that either think similarly to the tech companies or kowtow to the left-wing outrage mob. Think about that. As obnoxious and creepy and frankly terrifying as the Chinese social credit system is, you can make a pretty good argument that we are in the early stages of effectively living in that same environment, but without the government being in control of it. Wrap your head around that for a moment and think about whether it's time for you and me and others on the conservative side of the fence in America to rethink how we view our approach to corporate power over the conduct of other businesses and consumers in America. Let's talk some more about this on future podcasts. Next topic. Candidate likability. Likability is a different thing to measure, especially as to a politician. Let's talk about the likability question as to two Democrats who've been extensively in the media for the last few months and who've been the subject of quite a bit of negative coverage. Elizabeth Warren, the Massachusetts senator who disastrously attempted to show that her prior claims of being a Native American were not false by using a DNA test showing that she was roughly 1,024th Native American. I've discussed her false minority claim in prior podcasts, but here I'm going to focus on her attempt to show herself as more likable than her critics contend, presumably as a way to at least partially offset the tremendous negative backlash she received from her failed attempt to show that she's Native American. The second Democrat politician I'm going to talk about is Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the newly elected congresswoman from the Bronx in New York City. She's received a tremendous amount of negative coverage because of various less than astute responses to questioning, even though the media has not been willing to pressure her with tough questioning the way they did with Sarah Palin, for example. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had to confront a video of her dancing in college which she said was released by her Republican opponents and used in some way to degrade or rebuke her, although I found nothing to show that it was released by a Republican or that Republicans rebuked her for it. What did she do with it? She ran with it. She had herself videotaped outside of her congressional office dancing before entering and then released it on Twitter. Frankly, that was a really smart move. Perhaps it was easy, though, because by then the video of her dancing in college had already gone viral on Twitter as AOC dancing to every song. I have to admit that the Twitter page is infectious. I actually did listen to a couple dozen songs matched up to her dancing, and frankly it's quite entertaining, and she's a pretty good dancer. In my opinion, by the way, for what it's worth, the best was Prince's Let's Go Crazy. But the one posted which actually has a bit of humor to it is the national anthem of the People's Republic of China. The music doesn't match the dance moves, but her political positions come a lot closer to it. Clearly, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, or AOC as this dance video will probably ensure will continue to be the nickname applied to her, handled this incident quite well. As multiple conservative commentators have noted on Twitter, the video and her reaction come across as endearing. Having said that, it was also an opportunity for us to view how well Republicans dealt with the incident. At least with regard to handling on Twitter, in my view the best Republican response came from newly elected Congressman Dan Crenshaw, who tweeted this in response to AOC's claim that the GOP thinks women dancing are scandalous. Quote, "No one thinks this is scandalous," was actually pretty good. What is scandalous is increasing income taxes to 70%. It's wholly unethical for anyone to work a majority of the year just to give their money to the government. Dancing is great, but ideas matter more. Congressman Crenshaw's response is perfect, and it provides another piece of evidence that he's one of the major rising stars in the Republican Party. So what was the incident which Senator Elizabeth Warren had to confront? Well, it wasn't some video from her college years, but rather one that she had deliberately made recently as part of what may be the beginning of a campaign for president. I think it's nuts for her to pursue the presidency. I find her falsely portraying herself as a minority to be so repugnant as to be absolutely disqualifying. But she must think she has a shot. So she put out a video on Instagram filmed in her home, apparently to show that she's likable or relatable or like typical members of the public, It was so bad that I and at least one other person has joked on Twitter that it looks like it was scripted by Tommy Wiseau, the horrendous actor who wrote, produced, and starred in what many consider to be the worst movie ever made, The Room. You know the one, the movie that was memorialized by James Franco in The Disaster Artist. You've seen the clips from that movie, including perhaps the most famous one, where the lead character emerges from what appears to be a shed on a rooftop, talking even as he opens the door with nobody with him, saying, quote, "I did not hit her. It's not true. It's bullshit. I did not hit her. I did not. Oh, hi, Mark." Close quote. So here's Senator Warren's turn at playing an actor as horrendous as Tommy Wiseau. In attempting to look likable, Senator Warren, a Harvard professor, states on camera, quote, "I'm gonna get me a beer," close quote. She apparently thinks voters are so stupid as to actually believe that she speaks that way. Give me a break. She then emerges in a clearly scripted exchange with her husband that is nothing short of bizarre, including thanking her husband for being there in their house. I wonder how much she paid Tommy Wiseau to write the script. My view is that from a personality perspective, Elizabeth Warren is the most like Hillary Clinton of any of the Democrats who are currently being discussed as potential presidential candidates for 2020. As a result, I frankly think it would be great if she were the nominee, because I think the odds are she would lose badly. However, I don't think she'll be the nominee, and her handling of this recent publicity makes me suspect even more that she won't be the nominee. Next topic. Recent movies. A couple of episodes ago, I mentioned how much I enjoyed the movie Green Book. As I said at that time, I've spent so much time criticizing Hollywood on this podcast that it was only fair that I compliment Hollywood when it got it right, and it certainly did in the case of Green Book. Well, I'm only going to take a minute on this one. I want to mention something with regard to recent movies that has taken me by surprise. Until recently, I've gone for months without seeing a good movie at the theater. I've gone to several and left each one saying it was okay. Nothing really qualified it as a very good film. However, this past weekend I realized that the negative streak had been thoroughly broken. I've now seen 3 very good movies in a row. The first was Bohemian Rhapsody, the rock biopic about Freddie Mercury and Queen. The second, Green Book, which I reviewed in more detail a couple of episodes ago. Then, last week, I saw Clint Eastwood's new film, The Mule, about a 90-year-old horticulturalist who becomes a drug courier for a Mexican cartel. Eastwood both stars in and directs the film, which has been the key to his film successes for quite some time, with few exceptions. Between the 3 films, I would rank Green Book first, Bohemian Rhapsody second, and The Mule third. But the bottom line is all 3 were quite good. Is this an indication of a trend? Does Hollywood finally have itself back together so that it puts out good movies rather than catering to one small segment of the population and ignoring and insulting the rest? I wouldn't go that far. 3 movies in a relatively short period does not a trend make. But it is a good reminder that the movieplex still has much to offer, and we needn't just sit at home in front of a television screen or an iPad binge-watching Netflix. Do you listen to my podcast each week, or do you save them up and binge listen when you take a long drive? Either way, I look forward to producing another episode for your listening enjoyment next week. Until then, be sure to tell your friends about Political Spirits, and follow me on Twitter at Franklin Rye. Like me on Facebook at Political Spirits. This is Franklin Rye. Thank you for listening.